Hi folks, and we're back with our second video. So this one's going to be all about Act 1 Scene 1, the relevance of Act 1 Scene 1 in Macbeth. So Lesson 1 was all about history and context. If you've not watched that, you should go back and watch that first. But this one, Lesson 2, is about the very beginning of the play. Now the beginning of any play is going to be really significant. The beginning of Macbeth does a lot in a very short space of time. So if you look at your copy of Macbeth, you'll see that Act 1 Scene 1 is not very long at all. But we're going to look at what it does, what it manages to achieve in just those few lines, and there aren't many lines in there. So we'll see the way that Shakespeare manages to get across various different ideas. Now, the first thing he's really doing here is he's establishing a tone. So we get, first of all, these stage directions, which are a little bit few and far between in Shakespeare. And if you've ever read any other plays, which you probably will have, then you're going to see that there are lots more stage directions in other plays than there tend to be in a lot of Shakespeare. Now, he does give us some really interesting ideas at the beginning of this. The first one is that we end up with thunder and lightning, and then we get enter three witches. So I want us to think about those things to start with. Remember that stage directions are perfectly valid quotes to use in an essay. So you can use these as quotes if you want to talk about something relevant to them, like establishing tone and mood at the beginning. So thunder and lightning, if we think about how that sets the tone and mood, obviously the thunder and lightning, we could talk about pathetic fallacy, and that being that the weather dictates the mood and tone, it being quite dark and ominous. All right, enter three witches. Why is that engaging to a Jacobean audience? Well, hopefully, if you've watched the previous video, you'll know that they were fascinated with the supernatural, and especially at this time, witches. So that is something that's going to capture their attention. Now, the fact that this happens at the very beginning is really important for two reasons. It links to a couple of things that we can sometimes overlook when we're writing these essays. Now, the first one is structure. We have a tendency not to necessarily think about structure too much when we're talking about a play like Macbeth, but it's a really useful thing to use if it's relevant to the question, because it shows you've thought about the way the whole play's been put together. And Act 1, Scene 1, starting with the witches, is really important. That Shakespeare's saying, look at how important these characters are in this play. We don't start with Macbeth. We start with three witches, the witches themselves, okay? So the way that he puts this in at the beginning is significant. And the other thing is stagecraft. We need to remember that this isn't words on a page that we're looking at here. We're looking at a play that is to be performed. So we can talk about the way that that play may be performed. And the thunder and lightning is significant in itself, but also the fact that the witches will come on stage and they'll need to look like witches, and that will be engaging as well. So let's have a quick look at Jacobean theatre. This is a Shakespearean play, and although we might have a tendency to think now that the theatre isn't the most common form of entertainment, coming second to things like cinema and TV and things like that, at the time this was an art form for the general public to access stories. So lots and lots of people went to see these plays. Whether they were rich or poor, they would go and access these stories. And somewhere like the Globe Theatre, which was a very popular theatre in that time, would be very busy and incredibly chaotic places. During a day when there was a play on, there'd be lots of people packed in there. So one of the ways to quieten down an audience at the beginning of a performance is to give them something really engaging to start with. Now, that's quite difficult to do when you've got no microphones or special effects or lighting. It would just be daylight that would be coming through the hole in the roof, the big circular hole in the roof to light the stage. So there's nothing you can do dramatically with that. And you've got, maybe up to 1,000 people in there that are sort of waiting for a play to start, but also just enjoying themselves and having a chat. So to quieten down that audience, a really good way to do it is by having something that might imitate thunder and lightning, possibly, especially the sound of it, and then these witches standing on stage and appearing on stage in some way. And that would get their attention. Now, it's also the reason why we don't really learn a great deal about the play in the first scene. It's more about what we see and the way that the mood and the tone are established, rather than as actually finding out something about the storyline, if you like, because it's quite possible that a Jacobean audience would miss the beginning of that because they'd be too loud and then we'd need them to quieten down before we could start delivering the story. So their appearance, the stagecraft, is really significant from that point of view. But let's have a look at what they say anyway, because what they say is quite important in establishing a few ideas. So what do they say? Okay, some of the key points here are relating to equivocation and mystery. Now, equivocation is something we talked about in the last video, about saying one thing and meaning another. And when they say, when the battle's lost and won, and they say fair is foul and foul is fair, you can see that that's a use of juxtaposition, these opposites put together. And that links to these ideas that run through the whole play. So equivocation being one, appearance versus reality, so things not appearing to be what they actually are, and deception, trying to deceive Macbeth and other characters, Macbeth trying to deceive people, those sorts of things. So those quotes and that language fit really well with that. And we can take that tone and that link to theme from this very first section, this very first, very short scene. Okay? Now, how do they say it? How do they say these words? Well, that's really important as well. You know, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? So they speak in a very specific way, and they establish that in this first scene as well. So the first thing to note is that many of their lines rhyme. All right, and that's trying to establish them as witches and make them seem like they are actually sort of chanting a spell, maybe. Also, you'll see that several times all three of them speak together. And that's really significant too, because that adds to the whole feel of chanting and casting spells. And that's really significant in that point of view. But the other thing they use is something called trochaic tetrameter. All right. Now, what is that? What is trochaic tetrameter? Now, it's something that sounds quite complicated, and it kind of is complicated as well. So it's worth bearing in mind that no one's going to expect you to explain what trochaic tetrameter is in an essay. But I'm going to try and do that to you a little bit, just so that you can get an idea for why it's significant. So this relates to what we call the meter of the lines, and that's something you'll get in poetry too, all right? It's something to do with the rhythm of the words as they are spoken, all right? And trochaic tetrameter is a specific type of meter which uses 4 pairs of syllables that goes stressed, unstressed as it goes through those pairs. So you can see here, look, it says it's supposed to be kind of like ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. All right, with the stress on the first syllable and the lack of stress on the unstress on the second syllable. Okay, now many of the things run through that, and it might seem a little odd when you're looking at the lines to try and make it fit. But what I would like you to understand more than anything else is the rhythm of the witch's speech is different to other characters in the play, and that sets the witches apart from the other characters in the play. All right, and that's probably the most important part. You can use trochaic tetrameter in an essay to make it sound really impressive that you understand the meter of the lines and the rhythm of the lines and the way that it's been put together. But the most important thing is that that rhythm is very different to the other characters in the play. All right, so it sets them apart. Maybe because they're not seen as being as existing on the great chain of being that we looked at in the last video, but that style of speech is very significant. Okay, so why is that important? With the stagecraft, the thunder and lightning, and the costume and the makeup and their movements and the way that they use their voices and the scenery, yeah, it makes us think they're chanting and casting spells, and it links directly to that supernatural theme that's established right at the beginning. Okay, so it's not just what they look like, how they move, how they speak, but what they say links to that as well, and that's very powerful on stage. Okay, now something you could also bring in is this idea that Shakespeare does have a tendency to make his characters with magical powers speak with rhyming trochaic tetrameter. So it's kind of a thing that runs through a lot of his plays, that he makes them speak in this certain way. So anybody that's familiar with Shakespeare will understand that. But also, if you're not, you just understand that they are going to speak differently to the other characters in the play. All right, so that's how we're establishing this theme at the very beginning. It's what the witches say and how they say it alongside those stage directions at the very beginning. Okay, so quite a short video this time, but it's a very short scene, but you can see why this scene is so significant to the play. So let's have a look at what we need to summarize. What do you know about Jacobean theatre and the need to quieten down an audience at the beginning? What do the witches actually say here, and how does that link to the major themes in the play? How do they speak and how do they say it? And why does that link to other themes that are linked all the way through the play? Also, what do you understand about rhyming trochaic tetrameter? Make a few notes about that so you feel more comfortable using that term in an essay if it comes up and you're able to do that. So there are some things to summarise. As always, our big questions at the end link to these ideas that we've just talked about. How does the opening scene establish the ideas of deception and equivocation? Okay, so deception and equivocation are incredibly important themes in this play. How does this one little scene establish those ideas? Also, how does this opening scene establish the theme of the supernatural that runs through the whole play? Now, I'm hoping you'll be able to answer those questions based on just those little bits that we've written about. You may also be able to bring in some of the contextual information from the previous video, from video 1. But the other thing I want you to really think about is, can you insert a bit of information about structure and stagecraft? Because they're the things that we said at the beginning tend to get overlooked. Can you include those in your essay that you're going to write? Okay, that is fantastic. And have a look through that again. Make sure that you're comfortable with these different terms. Next time, we're going to come back and we're going to look at Macbeth himself and how he starts this play off.